Wednesday, 17 December 1862. Wonder of wonders, I've been promoted. It seems having my leg blown off qualifies as valorous conduct. They think, though, that only my little finger was amputated, and they want me to take command of C Company of the 14th Maryland at my earliest convenience. One of the doctors is writing Secretary Stanton himself to make my apologies. Teague sat on the side of his bed while Henry cleaned the blood from his ear and neck. "He just cut some on the rim," Henry said. "None's coming from inside." Teague flinched his head away when Henry's rag full of whiskey touched the cut. "It'll deaden the pain," said Henry. "Oh, well done." Teague pushed the rag away. "You are just a baby." Henry set the flask of whiskey beside Teague's coat and his own uniform coat thrown over the top of the dresser. The elbows of Henry's coat were patched with pieces of cloth that must have been meant as a best match, but were clearly several shades lighter blue. Henry had taken it off to wash Teague's wounds, exposing a moth-eaten shirt worn so thin a needle and thread for repair would have torn further holes. He put the coat back on now, and bet another of the coals he'd bought for the heat stove. Teague watched him sit in the only chair in the room, fold his arms to conserve body heat, and shake his head lightly at Teague's stump of a leg that hung a little over the edge of the bed. "Antietam," Teague said. Henry nodded, and then took his eyes off the stump. "Anything I can get you?" "The silver case in my coat." "What is it?" Henry asked, tossing over the small box. "My panacea. Good for what ails you, head to stump." "Whiskey'll do it, too." "Folks aren't quite as obliging to a drunk as they are to a convalescent war hero." Teague toasted Henry with a pill and swallowed it. "How'd you get up here, and in that?" Teague jabbed a finger at the uniform. "Too many miles to cover in a night. I ran when the war started, got into Canada for a while. Then when I heard they were letting us join, I came back. Haven't seen any fighting yet. I've been assisting our lieutenant with recruiting. But since he wants as little to do with us as possible, assisting means I come out here recruiting while he sits up in a fancy hotel doing Lord knows what." "Were those some of your recruits tonight?" "They were just drunk." "Not the kind of men you want, I would think." Henry nodded. "All the good men have already signed up. Same as anywhere else. All that's left are drunks and cowards." He paused for a moment. "Then again, I think they'll do all right when we give 'em something to work at. They come up here decent enough, willing to work. Abolition's strong in this town, you know. People are calling for slaves to come north and be paid for their toil. But people don't want to be the ones paying all those field hands who come knocking on their doors. That's what the drunks come from. Fighting'll sober 'em up." "I hope you all never so much as look at a rifle in this war." Henry squinted at him. "How long's it been since I saw you last? 8, 10 years?" "Closer to 8." "A full time. I did know you to slip down on to the river on Sunday nights to talk to that abolitionist preacher about all the slave uprisings that failed and what it would take to make one work. All in theory, of course. You and I both knew that man was a crackpot. Lived out of a canoe on nothing but fish and rum. Said it was locusts and wild honey. But you come back in the dark of Monday morning, wake me up, and whisper where Mr. Scott kept his guns. As if everybody on that place didn't already know it, and that you didn't need a key to get in the cabinet. Just lift the door a little on its hinges and it'd pop right open." Teague adjusted his pillow behind him so he could lie down, but still face Henry. "A lifetime ago," he said. "There's very little resemblance between that boy and me." "I see you're still writing, though." Henry pointed to the journal on the dresser. "And you do a fine job of it, too. I've been using that story of yours in the paper for my recruiting." "Don't. It's a lie. I'd feel like I'd sold my soul if I could be sure I have one." Henry was silent for several seconds, and Teague knew his friend was only now realizing that this cripple in front of him was a stranger. The moment passed, and Henry tried to resume the conversation. "Ohio's a long way from Antietam." Will's on Johnson's Island. Another stop in the talking. If Teague wasn't careful, they'd end up staring at each other in bemused silence all night. Is he all right? That's what I'm here to find out. He always was more like your father than you were. You got Miss Amelia in you. Always thinking. Teague shook his head. But I can tell you they won't let you in to see him. Colonel Pearson had it published a couple of weeks ago that only the very sick could have visitors. So if I were you, I'd be hoping this was a wasted trip. Well, I've already sent the request. Maybe they'll make an exception. Teague spent most of his third morning in Sandusky at the train yards, watching passengers arrive and leave with little thought to anything other than the loading and unloading of their packages, the whining of their infants, or the misprinting of their schedules. The triviality annoyed him, but another batch of prisoners was due in today, and he wanted to see them. They would have to serve as a vicarious glimpse of his brother if he didn't get a response from the prison very soon. His money was nearly spent. He could afford one more night at King's Place, he figured, but then he would either have to leave town or spend a few nights outside at the drum fire. Neither prospect was appealing. The prisoner train was half an hour late, so that by the time the men disembarked with their torn blankets wrapped around them like shawls, a delegation of ladies from a local church had arrived and had time to warm up their voices. They bustled as a unit toward the platform where the prisoners were lining up, but remained a good distance from them, as more than one man had a hardened look in his eyes. Their singing was hardly tremulous, however much they feared the men. Come ye disconsolate, where'er you languish, come at the mercy seat fervently kneel. Here bring your wounded hearts, here tell your anguish. Earth has no sorrow that heaven cannot heal. A bit heavy-handed, Teague said to the air, but he supposed it was better to throw hymns at the men than rocks or rotten food. A few of the men deigned to acknowledge the women. One even smiled, but most of them kept their eyes on their guards, ready to move as they were directed. Those rifles were a bit more real to them than any mercy seat, he thought, until the man who smiled started mouthing the words of the hymn while he stepped into the spot his guard indicated. Hope of the penitent, fadeless and pure. The man looked to be about 50, balding, with a thinned wreath of blond hair above his ears and a tuft at the top, an island surrounded by skin reddened from the cold. He raised his eyebrows as the melody jumped an octave at the climax of the song, as if he had tightened his vocal cords and forced out the high note himself. He probably led singing in his congregation back home, Teague thought, and probably had a strong voice aching to add some tenor or baritone or bass to the piercingly soprano ensemble in thick wool scarves and fur muffs. The prisoners were in ranks by the time the women had started their third hymn, calling for repentance from the Confederates, and the smiling man was still mouthing along. The smile became strained when he was called to face away from the women, as though the steam vented from the train and the orders shouted by the Yankees drowned out his mind's singing voice and the visions of home it evoked. Teague had a sudden urge to join the women singing, to add the baritone that the smiling man could not, to cut through the noise from the train and the orders, to obscure once again the future of prison life, the present of cold and hunger, and the past of bullets buzzing by his ear like stinging insects, and barely heard bugle calls, and barely shod feet rushing over rocks and shells, screaming like a woman in travail, and drummer boys calling for their mothers, and men calling for God, and doctors' saws scraping through bone, back and forth, and blood-drowned children gurgling, and men who should have lived dying, and men who should have died living. He had an urge to hold a high note long and clear. Instead, he swallowed a pill and left. Thursday, 25th December, 1862. It's Christmas Day. There's a group of carolers here from the Episcopal Church in town, and they keep going from ward to ward to get the men to join them in singing. Every time they come to my end of the ward, they break into God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen. After 5 go-rounds, one would think they would remember our faces and that they've already sung it for us, but they keep their eyes on the psalm books and won't look at us. The third time they started singing, I wheeled myself down to the other end of the ward to see if I recognized any of the newcomers. There was no one familiar, though when I stopped to take a rest, I noticed a one-armed Italian attempting to write a letter with his left hand, and from the look on his face, failing miserably. I do believe he would have started crying if I hadn't offered to help him. He almost did while explaining the nature of the problem in his broken English and showing me the illegible scrawl on his paper. His family reads only in Italian, but none of the nurses who had offered to write for him knew a word of it, nor could they understand most of what he spoke. I apologized and said I did not know it either. Then he started railing against himself, half in Italian, half in English. "Spanish and French I learn at school. Why not English?" I stopped him and asked if he spoke French. "Very much," he answered. I told him I spoke very little, but if he could fill in with French what he couldn't say in English, I could probably catch most of what he said and write it. There's a little English-Italian dictionary in the hospital's library. I could have a go at turning my transcription into Italian, and then give it to him for proofreading. I've heard French and Italian aren't that different anyway. So while the carolers started their fourth round, I scribbled what French I could from his dictation. I'm not sure about some of the spelling, but that's no matter. I'm sure when I begin translating it, I'll be able to understand those unknowns from the context. In any case, I have the first and last lines clear. "Dearest Mamma," and "Your ever faithful son, Guillermo."